Hello, I'm here with Galahad Eridanus, who has the channel with the same name on YouTube. I highly encourage you to check that out. I also quick shout out to Jonathan Demir, because he got us in touch, and I've had correspondences with him for the last few months. I guess the first question I have is the most general, is what is our role as humans within reality in terms of structuring it and kind of the metaphysical significance of human life?
I would say co-creation with God. So the human being a microcosm of God is involved in the process of creation as described in Genesis. We're partaking in that all the time. And we're called upon to do it properly and to participate in creation the way that Christ did. But of course, we don't do that perfectly. But that's the way that I would frame it. I would definitely frame it in terms of a story, not in terms of an abstract philosophy, like this sort of almost mathematical description of what human beings are supposed to do. I don't think that it's actually like that. I would frame it as the way I said. We're supposed to be like God and to participate in creation like that.
Yeah, so starting at kind of the beginning of your corpus, you had this video, you Contact 2020. Right. I guess the question for people who have seen that is what precisely happened on December 14th, 2020, except for the certification of a very, very good election result and a highly effective medical treatment. And what did you mean by God will show up?
I don't think I knew what I meant, and I don't think I know what I meant. There are these times where I'm almost instructed to say something, and it's like someone who really knows what they're doing giving me investment advice and just saying, trust me, this is what you're supposed to say. And so I think we'll find out in time what it was that meant, but that's just what I was told to say. Exactly what happened? I mean, the video went up, and then, like you said, we approved a very effective medical treatment and certified an election result. There was an eclipse that day. I think in time more things will be revealed, because I didn't even know about those first two things until many months later. I actually didn't know that those things happened until maybe a year ago, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so the main thing that you talk about is kind of the transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, which Jung talked about as what's needed for that is kind of this understanding of Abraxas and the union of opposites, and that a lot of stuff that you talk about. But I guess my question is what characterizes the age of Aquarius as opposed to the other eons in human history?
That's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer, because I suppose we'll find out in time. I think it's a process of revelation. I don't think anybody could have predicted at the beginning of the Aeon of Pisces what the Aeon of Pisces was going to entail. What it looks like is right now people are moving in a more individualistic direction than they were in the last 2 millennia. And I think that that's probably a kind of corrective to an excess that existed back then, an imbalance. Or it could be just a very recent trend that's going to dissipate over time. I think what I'm seeing right now is a kind of Cambrian explosion of forms, a kind of rapid differentiation of religious ideas. And I think the best ones are going to survive. And exactly what that's going to look like, I don't think I know. But I don't know if I have a good answer to that, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let's start, like, what is like what is Aquarius as, you know, a figure versus, you know, and what could that have significance be, I guess.
I've heard it said that Aquarius is the sign of civilization because Aquarius is the water bearer. So Aquarius is the one who goes to the river or the well and collects water for the group. And so it has a very, you know, I just talked about individualism, but it has a kind of collectivist undertone in a certain sense because it's about community and it's about, you know, it's opposite to Leo, and Leo is kind of the sign of the self. So Aquarius is kind of like the sign of the group or the community. The symbol for Aquarius is two squiggly lines over top of each other. And what that always looked like to me was kind of coherent waves that are in phase. And the way that it's funny that there's a colloquialism talking about being on the same wavelength, you know? Yeah. So I think what it is about is the formation of probably a new culture or a new kind of culture, a new approach to civilization. I think civilization will change radically over the next 2,000 years, probably because of technology.
Yeah, how does that transition, especially in the, you know, short to medium term, how the transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius have to do with, you know, what I think in your work have called the consummation or solar temple, or what Langdon's called, you know, the human singularity, the tech singularity? Do you think that we're at that kind of bifurcation point now where we'll either understand, you know, the spiritual identity of our species or have an alternative negative outcome?
I have a much more pessimistic view than that, which is that both things are going to happen. It looks to me almost like humanity is on a path of speciation almost. And I don't think it'll get that far, but I see generally there's this trend that it seems like the majority are moving towards, which is lulling yourself into a kind of technological sleep, just watching TV, going to work, and doing what everyone else is doing unto death. And then there's a small minority of people who are using all of the instruments at their disposal to better themselves and to increase their knowledge of the world and their wisdom, like self-improvement junkies. I see a lot of that, but they're like maybe 10% of people. I think those people are going to get the positive outcome, and I think people who don't wake up from the sleep that they're in are going to get the negative outcome. I think both are guaranteed to happen. I think it's very unlikely that we'll get a situation where humanity is eradicated. It just doesn't, that in my mind, that's not a story that makes sense, but I suppose it could happen. I just don't see it on the horizon. I think there will always be a small number of people that make the right choices and justify the continued existence of humanity.
Yeah, who has kind of, because it sounds like you're kind of coming at this from a number of perspective, who has influenced your thinking the most in terms of the things that you talk about?
So there are two, and I would say that there's a kind of dialectical tension between them. And the first one is Carl Jung, and the second one is Jonathan Pageau. And they don't agree with each other. And Jonathan Pageau actually doesn't like Carl Jung. But Carl Jung talked about the goal of human existence as individuation, separating yourself from mass man, from the from being steered by the collective unconscious through life. And Jonathan Pageau talks about the goal of human existence as theosis, which is the traditional Orthodox perspective of what you're supposed to do, achieving union with God. And my perspective is that those are kind of the same thing. And that's what we strive towards. Like, becoming more fully yourself is to achieve union with God. More your true self, not the thing that you think is you. Other than those two, I would say I'm kind of a Platonist. That's how I think about the relation between the formal and the manifest. I actually don't read very much, which causes a lot of problems because a lot of my subscribers read a lot. But those are kind of the big three for me, just those guys.
Yeah, how do you explain kind of the phenomena of willful blindness? Because it's something that you talk about in your video and has to do with the kind of, you know, lulling of mass man that you just talked about. Is why do some people, you know, almost subconsciously or maybe even consciously choose not to see some truth?
I think it's an incremental process. And I think the way that it works is you start off by suppressing one small thing that you don't want to see. And that's all you ever have to do. You don't have to have a model of reality that you're blotting out. You just have to say, well, I don't want to look at that, so I'm not going to look at that. I don't want to look at that. I don't want to look at that. And if you do that over a long enough period, you know, you're blotting out so many things that you start behaving in a completely incoherent way. Because every time that you decide you're going to filter out this, that becomes an automatic process every time you make that decision. And so I think just making that choice over and over and over again ends up blinding you to a massive portion of reality. And, you know, it starts to look like madness eventually.
Yeah, that's kind of something which I've, I guess, thought about, is like that if you have a map, which is, you know, a highly simplified, you know, internal model of what the outside world is, then what you're perceiving is only the things which correspond to that. So I guess what is, you know, the global narrative is still a simplification, but, you know, the kind of basic understanding we need to drive us forward as individuals, as a society, into the future.
The global narrative? Geez. I don't know if there can ever be a global narrative per se. I think for Western people, Christianity has worked the best. It's definitely worked better than what we've got now, which is, you know, watch TV and compile your own meta-narrative out of that. Geez, the global narrative, it's something that is going to have to be discovered by individuals over the course of probably the next few hundred years. Because the thing is, I don't even think we have the beginning of an idea for what kind of story will sustain us as individuals, and especially as a collective. The problem is there was something structurally wrong with the narrative that we had before, which is why the vast majority of people abandoned it. But there's definitely something wrong with the narrative we replaced it with. So, but I think what we were drawn towards away from the old story, which was the Christian story, was alluring for a reason. And so what we have to do is we have to take what is alluring about this counter narrative, this antithesis, and bring it back into the thesis to make the synthesis. So it's like whatever drove us to create the modern world, there's something about it that's right. Even if, you know, the knee-jerk reaction from a traditionalist perspective is to say, well, modernity is evil and it's corrupt and it's perverse, which I kind of agree with. But at the same time, it's like, if we just go back, we're going to have the same thing play out again. So why did this happen? And how do we prevent it from happening in the future? So you have to take all of these dissonant elements of the modern world and find a way to work them into the old story. And I guess that'll give life to the old story again. So the new story is the old story, just revivified and resurrected, I would say.
Yeah. Do you think that it kind of has to do with the union of the two things you talked about with Pajot and Jung respectively, is kind of a meta individualist, you know, way of looking at it, of like your psychic individuation as, you know, an expression of, you know, getting closer and being in communion with God. And so we can each have those stories as individuals instead of having, you know, one totalitarian, you know, narrative globally.
So this could be a bit naive, but the way that I tend to think about it is it's almost as if the human body already contains the blueprint for the perfect society. And the human body, when you look at it, there really is no distinction between the collective and the individual. So you look at a cell, and the cell, what it wants to do just naturally fulfills the telos of the body, unless you have cancer, which is the only real exception. And, you know, something like cancer is what destroys civilizations. It's when the body loses its coherence. Bringing us back to Aquarius and the idea of coherent waves being on the same wavelength. It's like, I think if enough people were actually trying to individuate or achieve theosis, union with God, that would start to kind of constructively interfere in a way that would create a new culture that actually could sustain people's drive for meaning and could fulfill people's need for it. One of the things that I notice is that the people who really seem to understand what I'm saying, they'll often have synchronistic experiences that mirror mine. There are a lot of people in my comments who say that the same things started happening to them around the same time. And what it starts to look like is there's some larger thing that is uniting these smaller processes. And if we were all to just participate in the life of this larger thing, it would interact in a way that would be mutually beneficial for everybody. And so, you know, that's the kind of the way I think that the perfect civilization or the New Jerusalem lays itself out in reality.
Yeah. So how does that connect with the I haven't really looked into this, but your or I don't know if this is your idea, but of the consummation / solar temple. Could you kind of define that and how that connects with what you talked about, like I think I've heard that it like connects with the body, etc.
I've never actually talked about the consummation publicly. I've only talked about that privately with John, but the consummation
he asked me to ask you about it. So
yeah, I never really developed it and that's why I never talked about it. The consummation, I guess, is the idea that you can perfectly unify spirit and matter. You can perfectly unify the Platonic form of, you know, the way the world should be and the world as it actually is. You can bring that down. And that would be the consummation, the perfect union of heaven and earth. I think what's going on when you pay attention, there are these moments where everything aligns, and this tends to manifest as synchronicity or lucky chance, but things that seem providential. And what I think that is it's like a flash of that perfect union of heaven and earth, and it lasts for half a second and then it's gone. But I think so the consummation, which is a kind of eschatological vision of the New Jerusalem, is the idea that that flash could be extended forever. It could be an infinite process that's always happening. Because I think that those are kind of the nuclei of teleological processes. That's where the past and the future are extruded from, if that makes sense. So the consummation, if I were to put it simply, it's when everything aligns all the time. Everything is perfectly aligned and in perfect union with the divine at all times, which obviously isn't something that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's something to work towards.
Yeah, and it's also kind of something that the closest approximation of that, I guess, is constantly striving towards it. So it becomes kind of a dynamic process.
Right. You definitely can make, you can definitely get closer to it. It's like aiming at an infinitely small target, and you can be closer to the target, but you never quite get there.
Yeah. What was it like, I guess, creating the Abraxian cosmogram? Because the way you describe it is, and the associated, you know, things that you've talked about in your videos, because the way that you've described it is kind of as a almost terrifying experience.
It definitely was. The cosmogram was about a week-long process where I was sleeping. That's an older version of it, but that's the one that I made at the time. I was sleeping on a yoga mat beside my desk, and I would get about 5 hours of sleep, and it wasn't very good sleep, where I could hear a voice that was giving me these instructions. And I could never remember what the instructions were, but I could tell I was hearing or, you know, receiving some kind of information. And then I would wake up and I would play around with this image, and I would change things, I would move things around, I'd add things. And then at the end of it, I start looking at this thing, and there's all kinds of patterns that I didn't put there. And I'm still finding more of these all the time. Like I talked about in one case, obviously the corners form a kind of tetramorph. And those are the fixed signs of the zodiac. If you actually create a zodiac wheel using those, like by mapping those onto the fixed signs of the zodiac, then the nativity scene actually is on the line between Pisces and Aries, which is exactly when Christ was born, is at the border between the age of Aries and the age of Pisces. It's got the layout of the Temple of Solomon in it. It's got a pentagram that I didn't put there. It's got an ankh. It's got all kinds of weird things that, you know, were kind of created by accident. And this was a very destabilizing experience because you can't describe it to you can't explain to anyone what you're going through when things like this are happening. Because if you try and tell them about it, they just look at you like you're nuts. And so I think that was ultimately a big part of why I made the video, Contact 2020, because if I hadn't done that, I would have been isolated forever. I probably would have gone crazy. I started to approach something like insanity towards the end of that, and I only stabilized after other people watched the video and said that it made sense and that I was seeing something for real. If I hadn't done that, I don't know if I would have been okay.
Yeah. Were you surprised by how many people resonated with that video?
I remember one of the things that the angel said when I was given the instructions to make the video was, the way has been prepared. And he had actually said that people would say that. And he even made specific statements about who would say that and who I would get in touch with afterwards. And all of those statements were correct. Like there was somebody whose videos I was watching at the time who reached out to me after I posted the video. And I didn't actually contact him. He just found it and then messaged me. I was definitely, I mean, that video got, I think it was like 8,000 views in 3 days, which is a lot for your first video. So I was very surprised. And like 80% of the comments were just thank you, which is on YouTube, that's kind of unheard of. So yeah, it was definitely a shock. I remember I posted it and I think I went offline for like 3 days. I just wouldn't even look at it because I didn't want to make it. And then I went back online and there was this overflowing of thank yous and gratitude and people saying that they resonated with it, which definitely took me by surprise. Mm-hmm. I was expecting it to be like this awkward, uncomfortable experience that I would be glad that I had done, but that would have been not a pleasant memory. That's definitely not what happened.
Yeah. Is it intentional that the four corners are the cherubim in Ezekiel 1? So
it's traditional to put those symbols on the corners of images of Christ in the Orthodox Church, and you would call it a tetramorph. So they would say that it represents the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also the four living creatures from Ezekiel's vision. But interestingly, the symbol of Aquarius is a man, and the symbol of Scorpio can be an eagle, and Leo is a lion, and Taurus is a bull. So there's definitely, it's all of those things. It's the living creatures from the vision of Ezekiel. It's the fixed signs of the zodiac, and it's the four evangelists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is your kind of conception, I guess, generally of God?
I don't know if I have one. I think there's a reason that I depict God in the cosmogram as a shining void above Abraxas. And the reason is because I don't think you can capture God in a logical framework. The way that I tend to frame it to people is logical frameworks, it's almost like looking at things with one eye. And what you have to do to see God is have multiple rational frameworks, and then the contradictions between them, or the dissonance between them, will actually reveal a deeper landscape to you. And it's the same way that, your eyes disagree with each other, and they have different images of the world, and that's why you can perceive depth.
Yeah.
And so a rational framework will never be able to capture God because God is too much to fit in that. But a rational framework can help you to approach God. How exactly did you phrase the question? My conception of God?
Yeah, or just who is God?
God is the source of all creation, I would say.
Mhm.
And that's definitely as much as I can say with language.
That's fair. It's interesting this idea of God as above Abraxas, because um in Jung's seven sermons, so one of the things he talks about is that the traditional conception of God is almost too narrow, that it only is the summum bonum, the source of goodness, and not of everything, and that even the negation is the furthering of God's goodness, and that one simple substance from which everything emanates. I
Right.
think that and I think like it says this in the book of Isaiah. It says I'm God. I form light and create darkness. I make evil and peace. That everything is contained within a simple almost unity with no parts or aspects. I'm wondering what you think about that.
So often when you look at the original languages, what's translated as evil is more like bad,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of, earthquakes. I wouldn't
Yeah.
describe earthquakes as evil, but there was a time when people kind of did. And so it often, that bit gets lost in translation. Malice, I don't think, is part of the divine nature.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a way in which the potential for malice is part of the good. And the possibility of doing evil is what allows for a greater kind of good than if evil were impossible. So the fact that human beings have free will and that we can choose to do evil is what makes our noble acts so valuable,
Mm-hmm.
is the fact that we've chosen to rise above our lower nature and do good by choice. But there's some points of contention for me with Jung, in that he seems to want a God who's neutral and kind of morally ambivalent, which I don't think I believe in, but I would also say that he frames it in a way where he seems to say that God has created a universe in which things happen the way that they do for a reason. And we ought to perceive the divine. It's not as if God is causing evil, but God created a universe where evil can happen for a reason. And even evil furthers God's purposes. There's no way to actually prevent God from fulfilling his own intentions. Evil acts try to do that, but they never actually succeed.
Yeah. That was I wasn't agreeing with Jung's view. I'm probably, my conception of God is closer to what he was arguing against, which is the summum bonum, the source and sum of goodness. But just kind of steel manning that, I guess there's this line from Nietzsche, which is if you stare long enough into the abyss stares back into you. Do you think? And there's a corresponding kind of line from Jung specifically about Abraxas, which is what a lot of your work centers around. He says, looking upon Abraxas is blindness, recognizing Abraxas is sickness, worshiping Abraxas is death, but fearing Abraxas is wisdom, not resisting Abraxas is redemption. Do you feel like, because I guess this comes up with a lot of people who have gone into the occult, into esoteric knowledge. Do you feel that there are also negative influences possessing you, in addition to the angelic encounters which you say that you've had?
What do you mean by that?
Like, do you think that by almost looking into these matters that you're somehow putting yourself in spiritual danger?
Yes, absolutely. People, I get contacted by a lot of psychedelic enthusiasts, and I consistently discourage them to use those drugs because I think they're very dangerous. The reason that I do it is because I think someone has to, and I think that I can, but that's hubristic and dangerous, and I don't recommend it. It's kind of like I'm experimenting on myself so that other people don't have to. It's also something, I mean, it's something that I feel called to do. It's not something I'm doing. I don't feel that I'm playing with fire or taking unnecessary risks. And the funny thing is, every time I take large doses of those drugs, which I don't do often, I tend to get attacked. There are very, very hostile things over there, and they will try to convince you that that's not what they are. I'm very suspicious of the things that most people contact when they take psychedelic drugs. I wrote a whole article on why I don't trust machine elves, and why I don't like when people tell me stories about, the DMT elves and entities. There's a lot of danger over there, and I find I have to cut through a lot of noise before I can get to any real signal. And that's a very complicated and difficult and painful process. Like, I would say I encounter demons all the time when I take psychedelics, and I think most people do, but I don't think they always recognize them as that.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah. What is your kind of religious and spiritual background? And I guess in that vein, was, what you found in accordance or against your worldview?
So I was raised Orthodox. I became an atheist when I was about 12. And I think I came back to Christianity around the time I was 17, 18. I would still say I completely agree with Orthodox theology. And I don't think that my work actually contradicts Orthodox theology, but it doesn't contradict it in a very subtle way. I seem to have converged upon a lot of the same conclusions as the Orthodox, despite not really having any education in their theology. Usually it's brought to my attention that I'm saying things that other people have said before. So I would say for the most part, I'm just an Orthodox Christian. Mm-hmm. I just have a very radical interpretation of that. I could recite the Nicene Creed without saying anything that I didn't actually believe. Not that I know it from memory. I don't go to church or anything like that, but I mean, maybe I should. But that I would say is my background. I'm not really much of an occultist. I'm definitely too Christian for most occultists. Mm-hmm. But too occult for most Christians.
Sure, and that little space in between. One of the things that you talked about, I can't recall which video, but is kind of the need for to almost incorporate Gnosticism into a kind of more full and complete Orthodox Christianity. So is there anything where you do see yourself against the kind of orthodoxy in terms of like that?
I don't actually see, I mean, I haven't read any Gnostic materials that actually impressed me. Mm-hmm. Like the Nag Hammadi library is, maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's something very deep there that I don't have the prerequisite knowledge to understand. But it tends to just be a lot of speculation, and the library in general tends to disagree with itself a lot. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of contradictory things from one text to another. I think what's important, it's kind of like I said, where we had this narrative and then people broke away from it. And so in order to bring those people back, we have to take what drew them away and incorporate it back into the narrative to have a fuller story that, includes all dispositions and every type of person, I think. And so Gnosticism is probably the original schism between the Orthodox and those who couldn't be Orthodox for whatever reason. Yeah. I think the Orthodox got the theology right, but there's something about the Gnostic spirit that I like. Mm-hmm. The sense of individualism, the sense of skepticism and critical thinking, trying to understand things for yourself. these are all virtues, I think, but they're virtues that can run away from you, that can become vices if you take them too far. And I think in the case of a lot of Gnostics, that's what happened.
Yeah, and then what I think that the point that you made was that those kind of subversive elements in the early church then eventually become the kind of subversive elements to religion of, you know, the scientific and industrial and later revolutions against Christianity. That by suppressing that it needs to be incorporated almost into a higher unity.
Or it becomes a kind of satanic shadow that then becomes adversarial. So it's like the Gnostic sects inspired a lot of later secret societies. They seem to have influenced the Templars for sure. And then they bled into all kinds of other occult movements that existed at the time, certain forms of Hermeticism and things like that. So Gnosticism immediately, like it never really went away. It just saturated other things, which then became adversarial, you know, opponents to Christianity. You can kind of see a Gnostic thread in Nietzsche, in Giordano Bruno. You can kind of see it in Luther. It's everywhere, and I think people today are, you know, it's like a very extreme kind of Gnosticism that animates the modern world, where even, you know, the crass idea of escapism, you're still trying to escape the material world in some way by playing video games or watching TV or, you know, even getting drunk, taking drugs. We're constantly trying to escape materiality because we think something's wrong with it. And so even the culture of modernity is very Gnostic. It just doesn't call itself that. And so although Gnosticism tends to manifest in a very ugly form that is opposed to Christianity and to the culture that we've traditionally had, it seems to be that it contains necessary elements that have to be incorporated into our culture.
Yeah, and that's I believe Wolfgang Smith talked about this. He's a Catholic, but also a, you know, physicist and philosopher. And one of the things he talks about is that kind of the like futurist element of, you know, modernity is, you know, everything's terrible now, but in the future it's going to be great. You know, next 5-year plan. That's kind of a modern incarnation of Gnosticism, because once under, I guess, atheism and materialism, that those elements didn't see an ability to posit, you know, a kind of higher world separate from material matter, that you can have a future world separate from present, you know, material reality. So the
modern thinking is very defined by horizontality. And so we can't have the world here and then something up here, because we can't conceive of this anymore. It has to be over here or it has to be over here. So there can either be, this is the traditionalist idea, there's a golden age that we're constantly moving away from, or there's a golden age in the future that we're moving towards. But we can't conceive of, you know, a higher world, a kind of heavenly world that just occasionally manifests below us.
Yeah, how do we, you know, in your latest video, All Along the Watchtower, you talk about this idea of the labyrinth, that as we're at low levels of informational density, it becomes hard to see the overall unity of reality and consciousness. How do you escape or go beyond that, and as you know, a free thinking individual, or perhaps as a, you know, society?
I think first it happens with individuals. Individuals learn how to compress information and perceive in better ways. So it's like we develop better heuristics for looking at the world. And then we don't have to look at nearly as many things. We don't need to look at as many moving parts. So if you can perceive unities in multiplicities, you only need to look at the unities. And to do that, you only need to focus on a few details of the multiplicity. But if you can't do that, you have to look at the whole thing and monitor all the moving parts as separate elements. And so I think the world is set up in a way where there are these unities that unify multiple elements into wholes, but we can only perceive them as parts because of our metaphysics, because we don't have this higher world anymore. And so I think regaining our lost understanding of a world of forms or a heavenly kingdom is going to be a necessary aspect of that. And so we need to get back in touch with Christian metaphysics, or Platonic metaphysics at least. And until we do that, we're only going to be able to look at the world as a material machine, and every cog is completely separate from every other cog somehow. And so I think it's a metaphysical problem. It's a philosophical problem. As soon as most people accept that things are unified in unexpected ways, then it'll get easier. And then it's just a matter of listening to the people who are good at perceiving those unities.
Yeah. Do you think that you used the word gestalt in the video of kind of a, being able to understand things from a higher order perspective? Do you think that at least from your understanding and from, what we've talked about, that is the CTMU kind of that provides that, Christian Platonic-esque, metaphysic, which can, unify those insights about reality?
So I think it provides the beginning of it. The CTMU, I haven't looked into it enough to know if I actually agree with all of the propositions therein, but I think it's definitely a very, very strong theory, and it's better than any alternative I've found. I think the difficulty with it is that it's not something that most people can understand. And so this is kind of one of the things that I see in the world right now, is that a small group of people who are willing and able to understand these things are going to have to bring them down to a level where people can understand them and incorporate them into their lives. Religion is like that, in that the Christian story contains very, very deep metaphysical ideas contained in very, very simple stories. You can think about the parables of Christ as a kind of perfect microcosm of that. So I think the CTMU is a viable a strong candidate for that, but it's kind of like Platonic philosophy was in the ancient world, where it's something that never really took with the masses and something that couldn't have taken with the masses. But then Christianity comes along, and, as Nietzsche says, it's kind of Platonism for the people. I think we need a CTMU for the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of this, this idea of that this is in the, the Gospels, that this is happening literally. It's like the Logos is made flesh.
Yeah,
kind of, that there has
to and then people can relate to it.
Mm-hmm.
But until that happens, it's something that only very logical people can relate to.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested, like, do you believe in the miracles and resurrection of Jesus?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not certain of very many things, but I'm certain of the resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the follow up to that is how would you define, magic, miracles, and how do those?
Can you hear me? I think I might have lost you.
Oh no, I think we're good.
Okay, I got you back now.
Awesome.
Sorry, what were you saying?
How would you define magic? Because this is one of the things that we talked about.
I think magic can only be magic when it's undefined, and then after it's defined, it just becomes metaphysics. So magic is kind of taking forces that we don't fully understand and playing with them. And so, I think the best definition of magic is probably the one that Aleister Crowley came up with, ironically enough, which is the science or art of causing change in accordance with the will. And, that's the idea that you make something change from one thing to another or something changes from one thing to another in the way that you wanted it to, in the absence of any causal, with or without any causal mechanism there. So say you want it to rain tomorrow. You don't, I don't know if you can do this, but say you want it to rain tomorrow, and then you do something that's supposed to make it rain tomorrow, and then it does. You could classify that possibly as successful magic, because it's change in accordance with the will. And if you could do that consistently, that would be magic. I think miracles, I'm reluctant to even consider them the same thing. I think both exist, but magic is almost, I mean, maybe they are the same thing. Magic is when consciousness affects reality in ways that cannot be explained by traditional causality. And I think that happens all the time, but I think people are unconscious of it because we don't frame the world as a place where that can happen. So when something like the resurrection of Jesus happens, I think that's a case of consciousness affecting reality in an unexpected way. But exactly how it's happening, why it's happening, I don't think we fully understand. And that's what makes it, magic or a miracle.
Yeah.
I think at some point it'll be something we maybe not the resurrection, maybe that's too far away, but simple things like maybe turning water into wine. Maybe that's something one day we'll understand.
Yeah.
But for now we don't, and that's what makes it miraculous.
Yeah, and I guess the kind of traditional what people would say was the boundary between a miracle and the sort of magic that Aleister Crowley is talking about is that one is coming from your individual human will and maybe other influences, and then one is coming from God.
Right. So what I would say there is consciousness has certain capacities to affect reality in ways that we don't understand at the moment. So, thoughts and intentions can cause physical events without clear causal connections. Now, the question for whether it's a miracle or magic is, are you working in accordance with God's will? Mm-hmm. And if you are, and especially if you're working very closely in accordance with God's will, that's a miracle. Magic is more when it's opportunistic, technical, and self-serving, I would say. So you want some woman and you do some kind of ritual to make her fall in love with you. Again, I don't know if that works. It tends to backfire in the stories I've heard of it theoretically working, and it makes sense that it backfires. So I think it's probably the same process, but definitionally it makes sense to separate them.
Yeah, what is your favorite book of or story from the Bible that connects most with you personally?
That's difficult. I really like Revelation. Revelation is probably one of my favorites, but I also really like Exodus. I find Exodus is probably it's the best story like as a narrative, because Moses is like a human being. He's like a man. Jesus feels he's very difficult to relate to, and the apostles are hard to conceptualize as characters a lot of the time. But Moses feels pretty well defined. And then also in Genesis, there's a lot of very colorful characters. I always related to Jacob when I was young. Maybe that says something bad about me, but I always did relate to Jacob. I would probably go with Revelation in the end, though, just because it leaves the most room for speculation, and it gives you a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, I feel like Jacob's kind of the most almost relatable character in the Bible, because he goes from goes literally from being Yaakov, from being a heel grabber, to someone who to Israel, to someone who's struggling with God and prevails, and he's doesn't have a perfect life, but he serves in love and becomes a good person throughout the story.
one of the things that's very interesting about him is that he sort of illustrates what I said with good is greater because of the possibility of evil. He seems to be somebody who wrestles with his lower nature a lot, somebody to whom evil actions come quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was why I always related to him. And so I think God favors him the way that he does, because despite that fact, he does choose to do good in the end. And, you know, he becomes a good person by the end of the story. And it seems like that doesn't come very naturally to him.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the symbolism of, you know, of Jacob's ladder is, you know, the angels ascending up and down from earth to heaven, is that.
Yeah.
What I guess I asked you, or like, what is something in your life which, you know, looking back, you now see the kind of significance or connectivity of?
So just going off of Jacob, there was an experience I had when I was 19. I'll be laying quite a bit bare here, but when I was 19, I was very depressed. I was very unhappy with life and the direction it looked like life was going in. And so I decided that instead of suicide, I was going to take 750 micrograms of LSD, which is like 250 is a trip. 500 is a lot. 750 is like, maybe you'll need to be institutionalized. And what I experienced was going down into hell. I thought I had died. I thought I'd taken fake acid, which can kill you very easily. And I thought I was dead. I thought I could hear my parents in the other room finding my body, because I thought that was where I had died. Somehow I got it in my head that the only way that I could fix this was in this fake world that I was living in, which was just a projection of my psyche. I had to go upstairs and tell my mom and dad what I had done and why, which I ended up doing. And I remember they didn't react the way I expected. They weren't angry. They were just sort of scared for me. And I went outside with my dad, and we sat on the porch. And we had this tree in the garden, this small tree. And somehow this had evaded his detection, but there was this long stalk of Jacob's ladder that had climbed all the way up the tree to the top. And I looked at it and I told him the story, because I don't think he knew it off by heart, Jacob's ladder. And it just felt so resonant at the time. And I remember that was the first time that I really felt the presence of the thing I would talk to later. I remember I was walking around my house and I had the sense that it was there, and that it was an angel. But I didn't see it. And there were a couple cases where I felt the same presence again. And that was how in 2020 I was able to recognize it as what it was. I thought, this is the same thing I saw back then. And I think what that was it was some event that was steering me towards the course that I'm on now. It was some echo from the future that was bringing me to, you know, the things that happened in 2020 and after.
Mm-hmm. Was that the most terrifying thing that you've experienced?
Probably.
Mm-hmm.
But I came out of it. So what was interesting was when I was in hell, or, you know, hell, the sense I had was that while I was there, I would be given whatever I wanted, but it would never be enough. It would never be what I really wanted. It would just be what I superficially wanted. So if at some moment I wanted cocaine, say, it would be brought to me somehow, and I wouldn't be able to resist the impulse to do it. And eventually that process would just rip me apart. And what I figured out was that the only way to get out of that was to want what God wanted for me more than what I wanted for myself. And then, you know, I would be brought that. And I think what was interesting about that experience was I learned what I would actually regret if I died, which I think was very valuable. And I came out of it saying, if you don't know how to die, you don't know how to live, which is something I still believe. but it was definitely terrifying.
Mm-hmm. What, or I guess you touched on this, but what kind of insight did you get into the nature of heaven and hell from that experience?
I still don't think I understand heaven and hell, but I think it definitely illuminated this idea that I've heard other people talk about, which is that the fire of hell is the same fire that comes down at Pentecost. It's the fire of God's transforming love, but if you're opposed to it, it burns you and it just destroys. And so, in some sense, there's something where heaven and hell are composed of the same kind of thing, but what makes one heaven and the other hell is how you relate to that and how that affects you. And I see that all the time. I see people who, when they're shown real, genuine love, they are repulsed by it or damaged by it because they don't trust it, because they don't have that in themselves. And it drives them crazy a lot of the time. I see that a lot.
Yeah. What is the, I guess, metaphysical significance of love, of God's love, of love for one another?
Love is unity in multiplicity, or it's what allows multiplicity to become unity. And so I think the significance of it is that it allows things in reality to come together and to move out of death. So death is when, a body dissolves into all of its constituent parts. And I think love is what brings those things together into something more than themselves. And you definitely see that in the case of families, in the case of even couples, you can see it, where, more than one person is able to become something that is unified and that has a coherent identity that transcends all of the individuals. I think that's the significance of love. Love is what allows the world to exist in some sense.
This is a question that I was just thinking about while I was kind of rewatching through your catalog. Is do you still have no phone?
Okay, so this is a bit of a confession. I have a flip phone.
Okay,
and I have a tablet. So the reason that I do that is, and I had no phone for 2 years. The flip phone was a compromise, but it allows me to communicate with people, and that's kind of necessary. The tablet, the reason I got that was because I felt I was spending too much time at my desk, being on the computer. So the tablet allows me to do those things somewhere else. I think it's not so important that you don't have a phone. What's important is that the phone doesn't control you. One of the things that happened when I got rid of my phone was that within a month, I was as happy as I had been when I was a child, which I'd never experienced when I had the phone, and I didn't think I would ever experience again. I was completely unstressed. My anxiety was gone. My depression was gone. It was like the phone somehow, and I don't know how this happened, but the phone was keeping those cycles going. And now I don't think it would, because I've been away from it. If I were to get another phone, which I don't think I'll do, I don't think it would have the same effect. But it was important that I leave it and be transformed and then come back to that kind of technology with the understanding of what it was doing when I used it unconsciously.
Yeah. Is there anything that you believe which you can't prove, that you just have a certain intuition for?
I think there's a lot of things I believe that I can't prove, unfortunately. Even the existence of God is one of those things. And I think what I'm doing to a large extent is just trying to prove it. I think if you look at all of my work, what I'm really trying to do is prove that there's a God, or at least prove that there's more to reality than people say there is. I want to provide an anomaly that is so implausible that it forces people to question their metaphysical assumptions. And And I think I've kind of done that, but most people won't sit down for an hour and a half and watch all of the evidence. Other than that, probably the connection between mind and matter, or consciousness and matter. I'm pretty much convinced that there's a very strong association between those two things, or that they might be even sides of a coin, but I have no way of proving that.
Mm-hmm.
I can only prove it in a very roundabout way, by showing the results of acting as if that's true.
Mm. What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh geez. I want people to. I just hope that I don't end up being Phaethon. So the reason I chose the name Eridanus is because the constellation of Eridanus is supposed to be the path that Phaethon drove through the sky when he drove his father's sun chariot. His father was Helios. Phaethon wanted to prove that he was the son of the sun god. And so he asked his father to let him drive the sun chariot through the sky, and he was not able to control it. And so he drove this very erratic path before, well, first he got too close to the earth and scorched it, and then he got too far away and it froze. And eventually Zeus had to strike him dead with a thunderbolt, and he fell into the river Eridanus, and his body continues to smolder to this day. It's a story about hubris and what happens when you bite off more than you can chew, when you're showboating. You know, when you're given a gift and you use it to bolster your own ego. As long as I'm not remembered for that, it can be anything. I'm okay with whatever legacy I end up having.
Yeah, what is the kind of significance to you of your channel name, Galahad Eridanus? I know from the beginning.
So there's actually a lot of thought went into it, but a given name is the name of an individual, and a surname is a name you get from your father. And Eridanus relates to my biological father, who I think was a Phaethon in a lot of ways. I can't quite go into that story right now. I don't think I'm prepared to go into it because I haven't met him yet. But he did a lot of things that are very similar to what I'm doing, and it ended badly for him. A given name is, it's like who you're trying to be and who you are as an individual. And so I'm hoping that I'm going to be different than that. And so I chose the name of the knight who achieves the Holy Grail, who finds it. And he's somebody who's not really like Phaethon. He's humble, which I don't think I am, but you know, maybe I can get there. So it represents a dialectical tension, I think, in my soul between this drive to be arrogant and to just show off and say, look at me, look at all these crazy things that I've done and that have happened to me, and also trying to do something that I think is important and necessary for the greater good and for the purpose of others.
Yeah. It is our age kind of haunted by gods and demons, as Jung kind of believed and expressed in his works.
Yes. And you can see it everywhere. I don't think they call themselves that anymore, but I think the same things are always running around. Money is one of them. Brands are another example. Corporations, which want to be people, which say that they're people, and which are treated by the law as people. Those are, you can think of them as like tribal deities in a way, or comparable to that. Nations are that. Cities can be that. Families can be that. There are all of these unities that are not perceived by us as unities, but nonetheless behave that way. And some of them are small, like families, or like, you know, a club, like a band. But some of them are very large and span millennia, and those would be things like archetypes, which tend to manifest in the form of amoral gods like Mars or Mercury or Jupiter.
Yeah, how does that kind of, egregorial conception of looking at the organization of the world contribute to, I guess, your conception of Satan?
Ooh, I don't know if I know how to answer that. Satan is almost like noise, like a feedback loop, where imperfection amplifies itself and becomes self-sustaining. And so what ends up happening, if you're to look at the Christian story, for example, you have the character of Judas, who betrays Christ from within the group, from within his own selected apostles. What tends to happen in any organization is that there are certain people who are in it for themselves, and this happens at every level of reality. So cancer is like that. Cancer is a part of your own body that is in it for itself. It doesn't want to participate in the life of the whole. And so it ends up destroying the whole. It ends up bringing the whole into death. And I think that's basically what Satan is at every level of reality. He's that thing that pulls the higher levels down and breaks unities apart. That's why in the cosmogram, at the top, you have this shining void, which represents God. But at the bottom, you don't have Satan, you just have a skull. You just have death. It's as if Satan is just the gravitational pull that brings us down towards disillusion.
Do you, in your video, the money and magic, you kind of skirt around this, but like is money evil?
No. So I'm reading a book right now called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And in it, one of the phrases that keeps getting repeated is, I don't work for money, money works for me. And what I did the other day was I replaced that with mammon. So I don't work for mammon, mammon works for me. And what that called to mind was the image of Solomon binding 72 demons and forcing them to build the temple. And so it's like you can take these forces which, when they possess us, are evil, but you can bind them and bring them under the control of the human will, which is subordinate to God in theory, and then you can make them do good in the world. But when you let them control you, they just do whatever they feel like doing, which is very self-serving. So money's not evil, but it makes people do evil things. And the love of money is the root of all evil.
Yeah, this is, kind of the broadest, stupidest question, but like, what is the meaning of life? So it's kind of the first question I asked too, but
the meaning of life is to make choices that make the world better. And I think that involves a tremendous amount of self-sacrifice, but I think it doesn't have to be self-sacrificing to the point of self-flagellation or self-loathing. You can have this situation in which the self-sacrifice, the story of Christ's self-sacrifice ends with the resurrection. So he gets a happy ending. And I think when you decide to make the choice intentionally to give up your own happiness for the sake of others, you tend to end up happier than if you pursued happiness. I don't know exactly how to say what the meaning of life is, but I know what I think it isn't. And the pursuit of happiness is that. I don't think life is about pursuing happiness, because I think if you do that, you don't tend to find very much of it. You get these flashes of not even joy, just kind of hedonic pleasure, and then a lot of misery. But if you try to spend your time bettering life for other people and giving up what you think is important for their sake, you tend to end up very happy, I've found. And I think that's the meaning of life.
Yeah, I used to ask closing is shamelessly stole from Lex Friedman of what is your advice to young people, but I changed it just because I am a young person. Just what is your advice to me personally?
Oh, advice. Advice is hard because I think people have to decide for themselves what direction they want their life to go in. And I'm better at specific problems. But what I would say is keep an open mind and okay, love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. That's maybe the best advice anyone can give you.
That's good. It's top 2 commandments.
Yeah.
We hear from JC. The any closing thoughts? Anything else you wanted to discuss?
No, I think we've kind of covered everything. I'm very tired at the moment, to be honest. So I think things aren't flowing as naturally as they might otherwise. But it was a very good conversation. I'm glad you had me on.
Awesome. Thank you. Peace.
Take care.
We can close.